Hey, seventh grade. So we're on chapter 10, and Raymond has just agreed to come to the island. Hurry up, boy, said Mr. Fulton, giving Ben a push. You've got the potatoes to bring in from the cellar still, and there's a brass strip to polish and the milk bottles to swill. The butler was a tall, grim man who ruled with a rod of iron and never smiled. "He's in a dream this morning," said Mrs. Flint. "I've had to tell him 3 times to wipe down the stove." Cooks are often fat and cheerful, but she was thin and cross and seemed to hate the food she prepared. The only housemaid, Rosita, gave Ben a kind glance. The boy looked thoroughly washed out, as though he hadn't slept. Rosita was right. Ben had scarcely closed his eyes after he crept in from the park the night before. He was glad, of course, that Raymond had agreed to go with the rescuers. He had to be glad. Cor and Gerke had been so relieved that their job was done, but as he dragged the heavy sack of potatoes up the cellar steps, he felt as wretched as he had ever felt in his life. In half an hour, Raymond would leave the house and never come back. On Monday morning, he went to the house of a Mrs. Frankenmeyer, who gave him exercises to cure his flat feet and knock knees. Mrs. Frankenmeyer was very easygoing and wouldn't notice if he didn't turn up, and he was going to meet the rescuers at the corner of her street instead of going to school. Just about the time that Ben would be sitting in his classroom and opening his arithmetic book, Raymond would be stepping out onto the sands of the secret cove. As he went to fetch his school bag, Ben's foot bumped against the cat tray under his bed. He had almost house-trained the mistmaker even in the 3 days he had hidden him in his room. The animal was incredibly intelligent, and the realization that he would never see him again suddenly seemed more than he could bear. Ben had accepted his life, the early morning chores, the drudgery again when he came home at night, but that was before he had found people who really understood him and were his friends. And he had quarreled with Oj. "You're coming with us, of course," Oj had said. "You're coming to the island." And he had said, "I can't, Oj." The hag had been furious. "Of course you can. If you're worried about Raymond being such a pain, you needn't be. Because if he isn't any better by the time he's grown up, I'll start a revolution and have his head chopped off. You can rely on that." "It isn't Raymond, Oj. I don't care about him. It's my grandmother. She took me in because I had nobody, and I can't leave her now that she's ill. You must see that." But Oj hadn't seen it. She stamped her feet and called him names, and even when Cor had agreed with Ben and said you had to stand by people who helped you, she went off in a huff. Well, it didn't matter now. He'd never see any of them again. Ben usually liked school, but this morning the shabby old building with the high windows made him feel as though he was in a trap. And to make things worse, his usual teacher was ill, and the student who took over was obviously terrified of kids. It would be uproar all morning, thought Ben, and he was right. At break, he didn't join his friends, but went off on his own to a quarter of the play yard. You had to take one day at a time when things were bad, Nanny had told him. But today it seemed as though the steps would lead down the grayest, dreariest road he could imagine. There was a grating in the asphalt covering a drain, and he crouched down beside it, wondering if the plodger was somewhere nearby in his wellies. And that made him think of Melisande and the knuckle with his interesting face. Well, that was over, and forever. He'd never see magic again, not an ordinary boy like him. For a moment, he wondered whether to change his mind. The gump was still open. The rescuers had trusted him. They had told him where it was. They hadn't told Raymond, but they told him. He closed his eyes and saw the 3-masted sailing ship parting the waves, saw the green hump of the island with its golden sands, and the sun shining on the roofs of the palace. Then the picture vanished, and there was another picture in its stead. An old woman lying in a high hospital bed, shrunken, ill, watching for him as he came down the ward. The teacher blew her whistle. The children began to stream back into the building, but Ben still lingered. Then he looked up. A small girl was coming across the road towards him. She wore an old-fashioned blazer. Her thick black hair was yanked into 2 pigtails, and she was scowling. Ben scrambled to his feet. He tried to be sensible. He really tried. But a lump had come into his throat, and he stretched his hand through the bars like a prisoner. "Oh, Odge," he said, "I'm so terribly pleased to see you." Raymond had not kept his promise. He had not turned up at the corner of Mrs. Frankenheimer Street as he said he would. They had waited and waited, but Raymond had not come. "We should have known that pig boy would double-cross us," said Odge. "The others are in an awful state. Gertie keeps saying if she had been a Fuath, it wouldn't have happened, which is perfectly ridiculous." "What's a Fuath?" Some real vile swamp fairy with all sorts of nasty habits. And the giant keeps talking about bopping and sacking and how it was all his fault because he didn't. And the wizard looks about 200 years old. He really loves the king and queen. But where is Raymond then? Well, that's it. Nobody knows. He's not in the house. The ghosts have haunted all over. Mrs. Straddle's gone as well. Ernie thinks that Raymond must have blabbed, and she's done a bunk with him. And that's serious, Ben. There are only 5 more days till closing. He's got to be found. Ben drew himself up to his full height, and the hag thought how fearless he looked suddenly, how strong. "Don't worry, Odge. We'll find him. I absolutely know we will." Ernie was right. Raymond had blabbed. When his mother came to wake him and told him he'd hurry or he'd be late for Mrs. Frankenheimer, Raymond yawned and said, "I don't have to go to Mrs. Frankenheimer again, not ever." And then Mrs. Straddle sat down on the edge of his bed, sending waves of man-eater over the coverlet, and put her pudgy hand on Raymond's forehead. "Now, don't be difficult, sweetikins. You know Mrs. Frankenheimer is going to make your feet all beautiful, and you really can't miss school again. The headmaster was quite cross last week. Just think if you were expelled and had to go to a common school with ordinary children." Raymond stretched his arms behind his head and smirked. "I don't have to go to school again, neither. I'm never going to go to school any more. I'm a prince." "Well, of course you're a prince to your mummy, dear," said Mrs. Trottle, giving him a lipsticky kiss. "But not that kind of prince. I'm really one. I'm going away to rule over hundreds of people on a secret island." Yes, dear," said Mrs. Trottle. "That's a very nice dream you've had, but now please get dressed." "It's not a dream," said Raymond crossly. "They told me, the old man in the park, the lady with the beetroot in her hat. I'm going to be a famous ruler, and I don't have to do anything. I don't want to, ever again." Mrs. Trottle went on tutting and taking no notice, and then she picked up Raymond's jacket, which she had thrown on the floor, and she noticed grass stains on it, and his buttonhole a spray of ivy, and her eyes narrowed. "Raymond, what is the meaning of this? You've been after I put you to bed." Raymond shrugged. "You can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me what to do now," he said, "and Dad can't either because I'm a prince and they're coming to show me the secret way back this morning." Mrs. Trottle now became very alarmed. She hurried into Mr. Trottle's dressing room and said, "Landon, I think Raymond's in danger. People have been giving him drugs, dreadful drugs to make him believe all sorts of things. It's a plot to kidnap him and hold us up for ransom, I'm sure of it." "Nonsense," said Mr. Trottle, stepping into his trousers. "Who would want to kidnap Raymond?" This was not a fatherly thing to say, but Mr. Trottle's mind was on the bank. "Anyone who knows we're rich. I'm serious. They've persuaded him that he's a prince so as to lure him away." "Well, he isn't, is he?" said Mr. Trottle. "Landon, will you please listen to me? I'm very worried." "Then why don't you contact the police?" "Certainly not." There were all sorts of reasons why Mrs. Trottle didn't want the police snooping around in Trottle Towers. Then suddenly, "I'm going to take Raymond away. I'm going into hiding. Now, this instant. You can stay here and change the locks and look out for anything sinister." She wouldn't wait a minute longer. Mrs. Trottle was a stupid woman, but when it came to protecting her son, she could move like greased lightning. Taking no notice of Raymond, sniveled and whined as he was a prince, he really was, she packed the suitcase. Half an hour later, she and Raymond drove away in a taxi, and no one who worked in Trottle Towers knew where they had gone. All right, guys, that's it for today, and we will read a little bit more tomorrow. Listen for tomorrow. Bye.